Few figures dominate 18th century English literature like Samuel Johnson. Born in 1709, Johnson was a poet, essayist, critic, biographer, editor, playwright, and above all, a lexicographer. A devout Anglican and loyal Tory, he combined political conservatism with what he himself called transcendental skepticism, and yes, this very phrase has been asked in exam. His moral seriousness and critical authority made him the arbiter of English letters in his age. Johnson's career was astonishingly diverse. His Life of Mr. Richard Savage, published in 1744, is often described as the first modern biography asked in exam. Later, his monumental lives of the most eminent English poets between 1779 and 1781 offered critical and biographical portraits that shaped how readers understood 17th and 18th century verse. He also wrote The History of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia in 1759, a philosophical tale, the tragedy Irene, and verse satires such as London and the Vanity of Human Wishes. As an editor, his essays on Shakespeare set out principles of textual criticism that remain influential even today. But pause here because his crowning achievement was a dictionary of the English language, published in 1755, asked in exam. This project consumed 9 years of his life and became the most authoritative English dictionary until the Oxford English Dictionary. In the same year, he wrote his famous letter to Lord Chesterfield, asked in exam, boldly rejecting aristocratic patronage and declaring his independence as an author. With that letter, Johnson embodied the professional writer free from noble support. He was also a prolific essayist. Johnson contributed to The Gentleman's Magazine and later authored The Rambler, The Idler, and The Adventurer periodicals, marked by moral depth and stylistic clarity, asked in exam. In these essays, he famously defined taste as that faculty of the soul which discerns the beauties and imperfections, asked in exam. This definition shaped the very meaning of criticism for his generation. Beyond his writings, Johnson was deeply involved in intellectual life. He travelled with James Boswell through Scotland in 1763, later recording their impressions in A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland. Boswell's Life of Samuel Johnson, published in 1791, became what Walter Jackson Bate called the most famous single work of biographical art in the whole of literature. Johnson also co-founded the Literary Club alongside Edmund Burke, Oliver Goldsmith, and Sir John Hawkins, asked in exam, creating a circle that defined the intellectual spirit of the age. Even in social matters, Johnson spoke with moral force. In 1771, together with Alexander Pope, he condemned the importation of 50,000 slaves into England, asked in exam. This act showed that his moral seriousness extended beyond literature into urgent political and ethical questions. Samuel Johnson was called the great Cham of literature, and rightly so. His dictionary, his essays, his criticism, his friendships, and his authority all made him not just a writer but the voice of 18th century English culture. When Samuel Johnson published his edition of Shakespeare's plays in 1765, he prefaced it with a 72-page essay that became one of the most important works of English literary criticism. The preface to Shakespeare is remembered not just for praise, but for its balance celebrating Shakespeare's genius while also pointing out his faults. Pause here and note this. It was asked in exam. Johnson argued that the unities of time and place are optional, not essential. Unlike many neoclassical critics, Johnson insisted that drama could still be powerful without adhering to rigid classical rules. What mattered was Shakespeare's unmatched gift for portraying human nature. Johnson called him a poet of nature, a writer whose characters embodied universal passions and experiences, not artificial conventions. Johnson organized his essay around 4 concerns: Shakespeare's greatness, his faults, his relationship to contemporary theatre, and the history of criticism up to his own edition. and within this framework he made statements that shaped literary thinking for generations. He observed, "Nothing can please many and please long, but just representations of general nature." And yes, this line has been asked in exam. For Johnson, poetry must both instruct and delight, and Shakespeare excelled in doing both. His comedies captured manners and social life with realism, while his tragedies revealed the depths of human passion. Yet, Johnson did not shy away from criticism. He pointed to loose plots, unnecessary repetitions, violations of the unities, and even anachronisms like Hector in Troilus and Cressida. He also lamented Shakespeare's neglect of poetic justice, believing audiences instinctively desire to see virtue rewarded and vice punished. At the same time, Johnson defended Shakespeare's vibrant language and his blank verse, praising its natural eloquence free from rigid classical symmetry. And he placed Shakespeare's genius in perspective by cautioning against blind reverence for the past. Antiquity, Johnson said, like every other quality that attracts the notice of mankind, has undoubtedly votaries that reverence it, not from reason but from prejudice. His point was clear. Shakespeare's long admiration came not from prejudice, but from centuries of judgment repeatedly confirming his worth. So, Johnson gave us a model of criticism, honest, balanced, rooted in universality. By weighing faults against genius, he elevated Shakespeare as the English Homer while grounding literary criticism in reason, judgment, and a faith in human nature itself. In the final stage of his career, Samuel Johnson produced one of his greatest works, Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets, published between 1779 and 1781. This monumental project brought together 52 biographical and critical portraits of poets from the 17th and 18th centuries. Johnson arranged the lives in roughly chronological order, moving from shorter sketches of minor poets like William Shenstone to extended biographies of major figures such as Abraham Cowley, John Milton, John Dryden, Joseph Addison, and Alexander Pope. Each life combined biography with literary criticism, weaving together personal detail, poetic style, and influence. But his judgments were far from neutral. They sparked debates and sometimes controversy. Johnson's Life of Cowley is one of the most famous sections. Here, he launched a sustained critique of the metaphysical poets. He said they were singular in their thoughts and that they affected the combination of dissimilar images, aced in exam. In his sharpest phrase, he accused them of using wit and imagination in ways that strained sense, producing verses rather than genuine poetry, asked in exam. And this is where Johnson coined his enduring term discordia concourse, the combination of dissimilar or contradictory images asked in exam. This phrase has haunted the study of metaphysical poetry ever since. Johnson even urged poets to distinguish nature from custom, asked in exam. Critics have often read this as the death knell of rigid neoclassicism, signaling a turn away from blind adherence to inherited rules toward a more natural and universal standard. His judgments could be biting. On Milton's late verse, Johnson dismissed it as verse only to the eye. Neither the easiness of prose nor the melody of numbers, asked in exam. Yet his tone softened when writing about Alexander Pope. Pope's biography was Johnson's longest and most admiring, praising him as a poet of clarity, polish, and refinement ideals that mirrored Johnson's own sense of literary artistry. So, what does Lives of the Poets really give us? It codified Johnson's critical principles: suspicion of excessive wit, insistence on moral seriousness, and reverence for poetry as a mirror of general nature. More than just biography, this work laid down a vision of English poetry itself, shaping how later generations read and remembered the poets of the 17th and 18th centuries. When we think about the 18th century, we often picture order, balance, and reason. But Edward Young reminds us that this age also had room for deep melancholy and the beginnings of romantic creativity. Born in 1683, Young is best remembered for his long reflective poem Night Thoughts, published between 1742 and 1745. This poem was written in blank verse and grew out of Young's personal bereavements, giving it an air of meditation and philosophical sorrow. It became one of the most celebrated works of its time. Read widely across Europe. Think about this. Night Thoughts influenced major figures like Goethe and Edmund Burke, and it later inspired William Blake, who created striking illustrations for the text. Pause here and note this. Young was not just a poet of grief, but also a thinker about literature itself. His prose work, Conjectures on Original Composition, published in 1759 and addressed to Samuel Richardson, defended the power of originality in writing. He argued that true genius doesn't come from imitation but from originality, a bold claim that anticipated the Romantic celebration of creative imagination and individuality.